The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We've talked about it quite a bit this morning because it is required. JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference on Friday, where he laid it out in no uncertain terms to the European blob members in attendance. Vance, as the Wall Street Journal opined, basically telling Europeans if they expect Americans to defend Europe for the sake of democracy, Europe needs to be recognizably small d democratic. Yeah.
Brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders. And it is the business of democracy to adjudicate these big questions at the ballot box. I believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what German democracy, what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered. Democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters. There's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't. Europeans, the people, have a voice. European leaders have a choice. And my strong belief is that we do not need to be afraid of the future. Embrace what your people tell you, even when it's surprising, even when you don't agree. And if you do so, you can face the future with certainty and with confidence, knowing that the nation stands behind each of you. And that, to me, is the great magic of democracy. It's not in these stone buildings or beautiful hotels. It's not even in the great institutions that we built together as a shared society. To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little.
And those remarks drew literally waterworks from the chairman of the Munich Security Conference this year, former German ambassador to the UN, Christoph Hüsken.
Getting a tissue.
After the speech of Vice President Vance on Friday, we have to fear that our common value base is not that common anymore. I'm very grateful to all those European politicians that spoke out and reaffirmed the values and principles that they are defending. No one did this better than President Zelensky. Let me conclude, and this becomes difficult.
Does his wife come and save him?
Oh, brother! I mean, if you didn't think the Europeans were soft before, good grief! For more on this, Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the CATO Institute, joins us. Justin, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
Your reaction to JD Vance's remarks?
Yeah, I mean, look, the transatlantic alliance has held together for decades on the basis that there are shared values in addition to the shared interests. And I think Vance's speech and the response in particular of the German defense minister, who sort of got the vapors after this, illustrates that we have very fundamental differences with Europe, right? The Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, came on after Vance and said, this is a loose paraphrase, democracy does not mean that vociferous minorities can decide what the truth is. It's sort of a weird philosophical statement. I thought about it for a minute, and I said, freedom absolutely means that each individual can decide what the truth is. They can even believe things that I think are untrue. That's the nature of freedom, right? I have very firm religious beliefs, and many of my neighbors vehemently disagree with those beliefs. We all have, our own beliefs, and that's the nature of freedom. And for them to say, we need the government to adjudicate what the truth is, I mean, if the past 5 or 6 years have shown anything, it's that we don't want to live in a society where the government can tell you what's true and what's not. And I think that idea of showing that the values shared between the United States and European countries, much less the EU, has been dramatically overstated.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And Pistorius, too, I mean, it might be useful for somebody to tell Pistorius. Have you ever considered what it would be like if you were part of that minority and the majority view as represented by the government was one that you didn't share? Would you want your ability to think and speak freely protected or not? I mean, it's remarkable. It's because it seems like this is such a rudimentary discussion we need to have, but it's one that evades the understanding of so many of these European leaders.
Yeah, it is a truly, sort of elite versus the masses situation over there. And I think, look, Germany is a particular example, right? There were all sorts of draconian restrictions put on speech in the wake of World War II, which understandable, right? If you're thinking 1949, 1950, you've just seen two really bad movies in the form of World War I and World War II. And so maybe we don't want to spin things back up. But the idea is that, National Socialism or sort of violent anti-Semitism is going to resurge in a place like Germany today just strikes me as totally fanciful. And so what they're doing is they're using these government powers that were granted in a period of extreme need, arguably, and extending them permanently into the future to cover things that were never envisioned by the restrictions that were put on free speech in Germany after World War II. So this is a sort of traditional story of government taking the power, and good luck getting it back from them once they get hold of it.
Well, do you think JD Vance's poignant speech in Munich is going to change anything when it comes to free speech in Europe?
Well, we always have this cycle where the Americans say, something provocative and say, the Europeans should take the lead on security in Europe, or we actually think free speech should be free. And then there's this media cycle where, we talk about these things and the Europeans sort of, rend their garments and agonize over things, and little changes. So I think the question is whether the administration keeps the pressure on and says, look, our values are these, our interests are these, and as you fit in with those, great. And as you don't, that's fine too. But we're not going to be sort of led around by the nose to be the permanent protector of Europe in an era where, American resources are scarce and American principles are not shared, certainly comprehensively, by states in Europe.
Well, the other thing I thought was really curious, I mean, it's lost in the waterworks, but that bedwetter, Christoph Huskin, invoking Zelensky as some sort of philosophical godfather when it comes to discussions of democracy. First of all, I don't really think, based on my knowledge, Ukraine fits the bill. And secondly, really, you're deferring to Zelensky in terms of what it means to be a Western European democracy?
Right. There's been a certain sort of fairy tale or cartoon narrative where, Ukraine has the white hat and Putin has the black hat, and this is a story of ultimate good versus ultimate evil. People do that during wartime, but the Europeans have sort of turned it up to 11 here. Zelensky's liberal democratic credential was spotty, let's say, before the war started, and then after the war started has deteriorated in a very predictable way, right? It's hard for freedoms to endure when you're fighting a war, against an army on your own territory. So things like canceling elections, things like shutting down opposition news outlets, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the Europeans have just made this, again, sort of cartoon or fairy tale narrative on this subject in a way that is emotional, right? It is the case that the Russians have invaded Ukraine and done tremendous amount of violence to civilians and infrastructure in Ukraine. But international politics is a messy, muddy business. And, particularly for the Americans, this is all going on thousands of miles away. So we should be careful and judicious in our judgments and not get sort of hopped up on these morality plays.
Well, the other thing, and the Wall Street Journal, even agreed on this point amid some criticisms of Trump and Vance. The Ed Board wrote, in general, Europeans are glumly conceding the Trump team has a point, at least on Ukraine and defense matters. Macron is convening an emergency summit of key European leaders this week to discuss their approach to Ukraine talks. You want to take the lead, or you want to be considered a serious partner in peace. Well, then come up with some concrete proposals and ideas, ramp up defense spending, and help us end the war in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, there's been this sort of, again, garment rending and all of this stuff about, whither Europe, right? Where is Europe's influence? But the reality is power is the currency of international affairs, for better or worse. And Europe has a power deficit, right? European states or the EU or however you want to construe Europe, they could very well be leading on this conflict if they had more material power. In fact, that they don't, it reveals why they have so little influence. So I think, for better or worse, Macron has been beating this drum for going on a decade now, and everybody in Europe hates the French in his own way. At some point, they're going to have to sort of come to the realization that Macron has a point, right? Either we need more power so we can have more influence, or we should just shut up about it already. And I think that attitude should pervade Europe, right? There's a choice to be made here. If you feel like your influence is too small, then you need to do more in terms of your material power. And historically, that decision has not been made to my satisfaction in the right direction on Europe's part. But who knows? Maybe this time will be different.
Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the CATO Institute. Justin, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Wesley Financial Group is not a law firm. If you own a timeshare, don't miss this public service announcement from Chuck McDowell, founder of Wesley Financial Group.
If you receive an unsolicited phone call or mail piece to discuss selling, renting, or especially canceling your timeshare, don't fall for it. If you really want out of your timeshare, hang the phone up immediately or throw that mail piece in the trash and contact your timeshare resort or Wesley Financial Group for assistance with your timeshare. As the only Inc. 500